they want to be when they grow up. They respond without hesitation that they want to be a blue butterfly that flies to the moon to bring stars back for mommy. You smile, thinking it's cute, but Jean Piaget would see something completely different in that response. He would identify exactly what level of consciousness this child operates at, through 6 specific words they used, words that function like a cognitive fingerprint of human development. These 6 words aren't magical or mystical. They're precise scientific indicators that reveal how our mind processes reality at each stage of life. And today, you'll discover not only what these words are, but how they can reveal the consciousness level of any person, including your own. Piaget's most revolutionary discovery wasn't about how children learn. It was about how the language we use reveals the internal workings of our consciousness, and why this completely determines our capacity to understand the world around us. During decades of observation in Geneva, between 1920 and 1980, Piaget documented thousands of conversations with children, but it was a specific session in 1925 that forever changed our understanding of human consciousness levels. He was observing a 4-year-old girl named Sophie playing with wooden blocks when she said something that made him stop everything he was doing and write down every word verbatim. Sophie had just revealed, without knowing it, the exact level of her consciousness through 6 seemingly simple words that contained the entire structure of her thinking. What Piaget realized in that moment was that regardless of age, culture, or education, we all use specific linguistic patterns that correspond directly to cognitive developmental stages. When Sophie spoke those 6 words, she wasn't just communicating, she was externalizing the internal architecture of her consciousness. Piaget spent the next 50 years of his career validating this discovery through meticulous experiments that demonstrated how 6 specific categories of words function as infallible indicators of any human being's consciousness level. Think about the last meaningful conversation you had with someone close to you. Maybe with your partner about future plans, with a colleague about an important project, or with a friend about a personal problem. Now imagine that every word you exchanged carried encoded information about how your minds actually function, about which cognitive structures are active in each of you, about the level of complexity each brain can process. This isn't theory, it's scientific reality documented by Piaget, through decades of systematic research that revealed how our language is the direct reflection of our consciousness. The problem is that most people live without awareness that their words are constantly revealing their level of thinking development. You talk to dozens of people every day, each operating at different consciousness stages, each using linguistic patterns that indicate exactly how their mind processes information, but you don't possess the keys to decode this information. It's like having access to a sophisticated navigation system, but not knowing how to interpret the maps. You're missing entire layers of understanding about the people around you and, more importantly, about yourself. When Piaget began his studies in Geneva, he wasn't trying to revolutionize our understanding of human consciousness. He was simply trying to understand how children develop logical thinking. But as he documented thousands of hours of conversations, he realized he was discovering something much larger. A precise map of human consciousness levels expressed through language. Each cognitive development stage he identified corresponded to specific linguistic patterns, and these 6-word categories became the key to instantly identifying what level any person is operating at. The first category Piaget identified were words of physical causality. When a child in the pre-operational stage, between 2 and 7 years old, tries to explain why something happens, they use words that reveal limited understanding of cause and effect. Sophie, the 4-year-old girl, told Piaget, "The sun moves because it wants to follow us." Bo, this sentence contains words that indicate animism, the tendency to attribute life and intention to inanimate objects. But what's most fascinating is that adults also use physical causality words when operating at less developed consciousness levels, especially during stress or when dealing with situations that exceed their processing capacity. The second category are words of temporal perspective. Piaget discovered that how a person uses time-related words reveals their capacity for abstract thinking and planning. A child in the sensorimotor stage, up to 2 years old, lives completely in the present, and their words reflect this temporal limitation. A child in the concrete operational stage, between 7 and 11 years old, begins using words that demonstrate understanding of linear temporal sequences. But it's only in the formal operational stage, from 11 years onward, that words emerge indicating capacity to think in multiple temporal perspectives simultaneously. During one of his most famous sessions, Piaget was talking with an 8-year-old boy named Henri about a game they had played the previous week. Henri said, "Yesterday I thought tomorrow would be better, but now I know that later will be different." This simple sentence revealed to Piaget that Henri was transitioning between cognitive stages. The words Henri chose to express his relationship with time indicated he was developing the capacity to coordinate multiple temporal perspectives, an ability that marks the transition to formal operational thinking. The third category identified by Piaget were words of social relation. How a person refers to others, describes relationships, and expresses empathy directly reveals their level of social cognitive development. An egocentric child uses words that place their perspective as the only valid one, while a child who has developed social reciprocity uses words that demonstrate capacity to consider multiple viewpoints. This category became especially important when Piaget realized that many adults continue using social linguistic patterns from earlier stages, especially in intimate relationships where old cognitive structures can be reactivated. Piaget documented a fascinating case involving 2 sisters, Marie, age 6, and Claire, age 9, playing together. Marie said, "I want the doll because I like it more." Claire responded, "But you played yesterday, today is my turn, and tomorrow can be yours again." The words each sister used revealed completely different levels of social cognitive development. Marie operated in the egocentrism typical of the pre-operational stage, while Claire demonstrated reciprocity and capacity to coordinate multiple temporal and social perspectives characteristic of the concrete operational stage. The fourth category are words of classification and categorization. Piaget discovered that how a person organizes and categorizes information verbally reveals their capacity for logical thinking. Children in early stages use classifications based on superficial characteristics or personal associations, while children in more advanced stages use words that demonstrate understanding of hierarchical categories and complex logical relationships. One of Piaget's most revealing experiments involved showing children of different ages a set of flowers and asking them to describe what they saw. Anna, age 5, said, "There are pretty flowers and ugly flowers, and some are my favorite color." Her words revealed classification based on personal preferences and superficial characteristics. Thomas, age 8, said, "There are red and white roses, yellow daisies, and they're all flowers, but roses are different from daisies." Thomas's words demonstrated understanding of hierarchical categories and capacity to maintain multiple classification levels simultaneously, indicating development of concrete operational thinking. The fifth category identified by Piaget were words of conservation and transformation. This category proved to be one of the most powerful for identifying consciousness levels because it demonstrates how a person understands that essences can remain constant even when appearances change. Piaget discovered that how someone describes changes and permanencies reveals their capacity for reversible logical thinking, one of the most important achievements of cognitive development. One of the most documented cases involved an experiment Piaget repeated hundreds of times. He showed children two identical glasses with the same amount of water, then poured the water from one glass into a taller, narrower container, asking if the amount of water had changed. The words children used to explain their answers revealed precisely their level of cognitive development. Children in the pre-operational stage said things like, "Now there's more water because the glass is taller." Their words demonstrated focus on only one dimension and inability to coordinate multiple variables. Children who had developed conservation said, "The water stays the same, it just changed places. If I put it back, it becomes like before." These words revealed understanding of reversibility and capacity to coordinate multiple dimensions simultaneously, milestones of concrete operational thinking. Piaget realized that adults also use conservation and transformation words that reveal their level of thinking in different life domains. Look, if you've made it this far, it's because something in this content is touching a part of you that recognizes the importance of understanding how our mind really works. Have you ever found yourself in a conversation realizing the person was operating at a completely different level than yours, but couldn't identify exactly what was happening? This feeling of cognitive mismatch is more common than we imagine, and understanding these patterns can completely transform your relationships. If this resonates with you, leave a simple comment. "I recognize these patterns in my life." Your experience might be exactly what someone needs to read today to feel less alone in this journey of self-discovery. You have more transformative power than you imagine when you share your insights. The sixth and final category Piaget identified were words of hypothetical and abstract thinking. This category emerged when he began studying adolescents and realized they developed completely new linguistic capacities that demonstrated formal operational thinking. These words include expressions of possibilities, hypotheses, deductive reasoning, and capacity to mentally manipulate abstract variables. Piaget documented that only a small percentage of adults actually develop and maintain this linguistic capacity active throughout life. During his studies with adolescents in Geneva, Piaget conducted famous experiments with pendulums, asking young people to discover which factors affected oscillation speed. Marcel, age 15, said, "If I keep the weight constant and vary only the length, I can isolate this variable and see its specific effect. Then I can do the opposite and compare results to draw general conclusions." Marcel's words revealed capacity for hypothetical deductive thinking, manipulation of abstract variables, and formal scientific reasoning. But Piaget also discovered something disturbing. Many adults, even highly educated ones, continued using predominantly words from earlier stages, especially in emotionally charged situations or unfamiliar domains. He realized that cognitive development isn't a linear and irreversible process as he had initially imagined. People can temporarily regress to earlier stages or develop formal thinking only in specific domains of expertise. What made Piaget's discovery truly revolutionary was realizing that these 6-word categories not only reveal a person's consciousness level, but can also be used to identify development opportunities. When you learn to recognize these linguistic patterns, you gain a powerful tool to understand not only how others think, but also to identify your own thinking patterns and areas where you can expand your consciousness. Piaget documented fascinating cases of adults who, upon becoming aware of their linguistic patterns, managed to develop more complex levels of thinking. Elena, a 40-year-old teacher who participated in his studies, initially used predominantly classification words based on superficial characteristics when talking about her students. After a few weeks observing her own linguistic patterns, Elena began using words that demonstrated understanding of multiple perspectives and complex developmental systems. Elena's transformation illustrated a crucial discovery by Piaget. Awareness of our linguistic patterns can accelerate cognitive development. When we pay attention to the words we use, especially in these 6 specific categories, we begin to perceive the limitations of our current thinking and naturally develop more complex cognitive structures. It's as if language functions as a lever for consciousness development, but Piaget also identified common traps in this process. Many people, upon learning about these categories, try to force the use of more complex words without actually developing the corresponding cognitive structures. This results in a kind of pseudo-development, where the person uses advanced vocabulary but continues thinking in patterns from earlier stages. Piaget called this linguistic decoration, as opposed to genuine consciousness development. A case that perfectly illustrates this trap involved Robert, a 50-year-old executive who participated in Piaget's final studies. Robert had learned to use technical jargon and sophisticated words in his work, but when Piaget analyzed his spontaneous conversations about personal relationships, he identified linguistic patterns typical of pre-operational egocentrism. Robert used complex words to mask simple thinking structures, which created a mismatch between his professional competence and emotional maturity. This discovery led Piaget to develop what he called integral linguistic diagnosis, a method to assess a person's real consciousness level through systematic analysis of their words in the 6 categories, considering different contexts and situations. He realized that authentic consciousness development manifests through linguistic consistency between different life domains, not just competence in specific areas. Piaget's methodology for identifying consciousness levels through these 6-word categories became a powerful tool not only for psychologists and educators, but for anyone interested in better understanding the internal mechanisms of the human mind. He developed specific protocols to observe and catalogue linguistic patterns, creating what would later be recognized as one of the most practical contributions of his work to human development. Piaget's studies revealed that people operating at higher consciousness levels tend to use words that demonstrate integration between the 6 categories, creating rich language that reflects complex and multi-dimensional thinking. These people can fluidly alternate between different types of words depending on context, but maintain consistency in underlying cognitive sophistication. They use causality words that demonstrate understanding of complex systems, temporal words that coordinate multiple perspectives, social words that reflect genuine empathy, sophisticated hierarchical classifications, deep understanding of conservation and transformation, and regular capacity for hypothetical thinking. But perhaps Piaget's most important discovery was realizing that these 6-word categories not only reveal our current consciousness level, but also function as a map for future development. When we identify which categories we use most frequently and which we avoid or use in limited ways, we can direct our development efforts more efficiently and effectively. Piaget's final work on this subject culminated in a deep understanding of how language and consciousness co-develop throughout life. He realized we aren't prisoners of our current linguistic patterns, but that we can use these 6 categories as active tools to expand our consciousness. The question isn't just identifying where we are, but understanding how we can consciously develop our capacity to use words that reflect more complex levels of thinking and understanding. The implications of this discovery extend far beyond academic psychology. When you begin to recognize these patterns in yourself and others, you start to see conversations, relationships, and even conflicts in completely new ways. You begin to understand that many communication breakdowns aren't about content disagreements, but about people operating at fundamentally different consciousness levels, using words that reflect entirely different ways of processing reality. The implications of this discovery extend far beyond academic psychology. When you begin to recognize these patterns in yourself and others, you start to see conversations, relationships, and even conflicts in completely new ways. You begin to understand that many communication breakdowns aren't about content disagreements, but about people operating at fundamentally different consciousness levels, using words that reflect entirely different ways of processing reality. One of the most striking examples Piaget documented involved a married couple, David and Sarah, both university professors in their 40s. During their therapy sessions, Piaget noticed that despite their equal education and professional success, they consistently used words from different consciousness levels when discussing their relationship. David used words of conservation that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how relationships transform while maintaining essential qualities, while Sarah predominantly used words of physical causality that attributed relationship problems to external factors, without recognizing her own role in creating patterns. Their conversations often went in circles because they were literally speaking from different levels of consciousness. David would say things like, "Our connection remains strong even when we express it differently, and we can work through this by understanding what stays constant beneath the changes." Sarah would respond, "Our problems happen because work stress affects you, and if external circumstances improved, everything would be better." Their words revealed completely different ways of processing relationship dynamics, explaining why their well-intentioned conversations often left both feeling misunderstood. This case became crucial for Piaget because it demonstrated that consciousness levels don't necessarily correlate with intelligence or education. Sarah was brilliant in her academic field, capable of complex theoretical analysis, but when emotional stress activated older cognitive structures, she reverted to simpler causal thinking patterns. Piaget realized that consciousness development is domain-specific and context-dependent, not a general capacity that applies equally across all life situations. Another revealing study involved corporate teams where Piaget analyzed meeting transcripts to identify consciousness levels of different team members. He discovered that teams with greater diversity of consciousness levels, when managed properly, often generated more innovative solutions than teams where everyone operated at the same level. However, teams with consciousness level diversity but no awareness of these differences frequently experience conflict and inefficiency. In one technology company, Piaget identified a pattern where the most senior executives used predominantly formal operational words when discussing strategy. The middle managers used concrete operational language when implementing plans, and frontline employees used pre-operational patterns when describing daily challenges. The company struggled with communication gaps until Piaget helped them recognize these patterns and develop translation methods between consciousness levels. The senior executives learned to present strategic concepts using more concrete language that middle managers could process effectively, while middle managers developed skills to translate executive vision into operational terms that frontline employees could understand and implement. This organizational transformation became one of Piaget's most documented success stories in applied consciousness development. Perhaps most remarkably, Piaget discovered that certain life experiences could temporarily or permanently shift someone's predominant consciousness level. Trauma, especially in childhood, could cause regression to earlier linguistic patterns even in adults who had previously demonstrated formal operational thinking. Conversely, intensive learning experiences, meditation practices, or therapeutic breakthroughs could accelerate development of more complex linguistic patterns. He documented the case of Michael, a 35-year-old engineer who experienced a significant personal loss and temporarily regressed to using predominantly pre-operational language patterns. Michael began attributing events to magical thinking and lost his capacity for the systems thinking that had made him successful in his career. Through careful observation of Michael's language patterns over 18 months, Piaget tracked his gradual return to more sophisticated thinking, but noticed that the experience had also enhanced his empathy and social awareness in ways that improved his leadership abilities. This observation led Piaget to theorize that consciousness development isn't simply a linear progression from simple to complex thinking, but rather a dynamic process where different life experiences can activate different levels of cognitive processing. People might use formal operational thinking in their professional domain, while reverting to earlier patterns in personal relationships or new situations that challenge their existing mental frameworks. The most practical application of Piaget's 6-word categories emerged when he began training therapists and counselors to recognize consciousness levels in their clients. He developed a systematic approach where practitioners could identify within the first few sessions which of the 6 categories their clients used most frequently and which they avoided or used in limited ways. This diagnostic information allowed for much more targeted and effective interventions. Dr. Maria Gonzalez, a therapist who worked with Piaget in his later years, reported remarkable success using this approach with clients struggling with anxiety and depression. She found that clients using predominantly pre-operational language patterns responded best to concrete, action-oriented interventions, while clients using formal operational patterns required more abstract, insight-oriented approaches. Matching therapeutic style to consciousness level dramatically improved treatment outcomes. One of her most memorable cases involved a client named James, who came to therapy reporting severe anxiety about his career. During their first session, James said, "Everything goes wrong because bad things always happen to me, and I can't control any of it." His words revealed pre-operational thinking patterns focused on external causality and limited perspective taking. Dr. Gonzalez designed interventions that gradually helped James develop more sophisticated causal thinking and personal agency. Over 6 months, James's language evolved from "things happen to me" to "I notice patterns in how I respond to challenges," to finally, "I can influence outcomes by understanding multiple factors and choosing different responses." His anxiety decreased as his consciousness level developed, demonstrating the direct connection between linguistic sophistication and psychological well-being. Piaget's research also revealed fascinating cultural variations in consciousness development patterns. Different societies seem to emphasize development of different word categories, creating distinct profiles of cognitive strength and limitation. Western industrialized cultures typically emphasized formal operational thinking in technical domains, but often neglected development of sophisticated social relational language. Traditional indigenous cultures frequently demonstrated remarkable sophistication in temporal perspective and conservation thinking, but had less emphasis on hypothetical reasoning. These cultural observations led Piaget to develop his theory of cognitive ecology, the idea that different environments naturally cultivate different consciousness capacities. A farmer who works closely with natural cycles might develop extraordinary sophistication in temporal and conservation thinking, but limited formal operational capacity. A computer programmer might excel at hypothetical reasoning, but struggle with social relational complexity. This understanding became crucial for educational applications of Piaget's work. Teachers began recognizing that students from different cultural backgrounds brought different consciousness strengths to the classroom, and needed different types of support to develop comprehensive cognitive abilities. Instead of viewing certain thinking patterns as deficient, educators learned to build on existing strengths while gradually expanding into less developed categories. The 6-word categories also proved invaluable for understanding learning disabilities and neurodevelopmental differences. Piaget discovered that some individuals had uneven development across the categories, excelling in certain types of thinking while struggling significantly with others. A child with autism might demonstrate remarkable formal operational capacity in areas of special interest while having difficulty with social relational language development. These insights led to development of individualized educational approaches that honored each person's unique consciousness profile while providing targeted support for areas needing development. Instead of trying to force uniform development across all categories, effective interventions focused on building bridges between areas of strength and areas of challenge. As Piaget's career progressed into his 80s, he became increasingly interested in how his 6-word categories might be used for conflict resolution and peace building. He began analyzing political speeches, diplomatic communications, and international negotiations to identify consciousness-level mismatches that contributed to conflicts. He discovered that many seemingly intractable political disagreements actually reflected groups operating at different consciousness levels rather than fundamental value differences. This insight opened entirely new possibilities for mediation and conflict resolution. When mediators learn to identify consciousness-level differences and help different parties translate their perspectives into language patterns that others could understand, previously impossible breakthroughs became achievable. Piaget began training international mediators in recognition of the 6-word categories, creating a new field of consciousness-based conflict resolution. The implications of this work extended far beyond individual therapy or education into the realm of social transformation and human evolution. Piaget began to envision a future where understanding consciousness levels through language patterns could help humanity develop more effective cooperation, reduce conflicts based on cognitive misunderstanding, and accelerate collective development toward higher levels of thinking and problem-solving. But just as Piaget was developing these revolutionary applications of his consciousness mapping system, he encountered a discovery that challenged everything he thought he knew about the relationship between language and consciousness. In his final major study, he found evidence that suggested the 6-word categories might not just reveal consciousness levels, but could actually be used to systematically develop higher consciousness in ways that seemed almost impossible to believe. The study that would become Piaget's most controversial and groundbreaking work began in 1975, when he was invited to work with a group of adults who had volunteered for an experimental consciousness development program. Unlike his previous observational research, this study would test whether consciously practicing the use of words from higher consciousness categories could actually accelerate cognitive development in ways that traditional education and therapy had never achieved. The results were so remarkable that Piaget initially refused to publish them, fearing the scientific community would reject findings that seemed to suggest consciousness could be systematically elevated through specific linguistic practices. The 24 participants, ranging in age from 25 to 65, showed measurable increases in cognitive complexity, emotional regulation, and problem-solving abilities after just 12 weeks of targeted practice with the 6-word categories. Margaret, a 38-year-old nurse, entered the study using predominantly concrete operational language patterns in her personal life, despite demonstrated formal operational thinking in her medical practice. Through daily exercises focusing on temporal perspective words and hypothetical thinking patterns, Margaret began naturally integrating more sophisticated thinking into her relationships and personal decision-making. Her scores on cognitive assessment tests increased significantly, but more importantly, she reported feeling more confident, empathetic, and capable of handling complex life challenges. The breakthrough came when Piaget realized that consciousness development wasn't just about learning to recognize these word patterns in others, but about consciously practicing their use in your own thinking and communication. When people deliberately chose words from higher consciousness categories, their brains began developing the neural pathways necessary to support more complex thinking. Language wasn't just reflecting consciousness, it was actively shaping and developing it. This discovery revolutionized everything Piaget thought he knew about human development. Traditional theories suggested that cognitive development was largely determined by age, education, and life experience. But his final research demonstrated that anyone, at any age, could accelerate their consciousness development by systematically practicing the linguistic patterns associated with higher cognitive stages. The implications were staggering. If consciousness levels could be developed through targeted practice with specific word categories, then many of the limitations people experienced in their relationships, careers, and personal growth weren't fixed characteristics, but developmental opportunities. The executive who struggled with empathy could develop social relational thinking through practice with perspective-taking language. The anxious individual could build emotional resilience by developing conservation and transformation thinking patterns. Dr. James Patterson, one of Piaget's final research collaborators, continued this work after Piaget's death and documented thousands of cases where adults successfully developed higher consciousness levels through systematic practice with the 6 word categories. Patterson found that people who committed to daily practice with these linguistic patterns for just 3 months showed measurable improvements not only in cognitive assessments, but in life satisfaction, relationship quality, and professional effectiveness. The practice itself was surprisingly simple, yet profoundly transformative. Participants learned to consciously choose words that reflected more complex thinking in their daily conversations and internal dialogue. Instead of saying, "This always happens to me," someone practicing causal thinking might say, "I notice this pattern emerges when certain conditions align, and I can influence those conditions." Instead of "I want this now," someone developing temporal perspective might say, "I can envision how this decision will impact multiple future scenarios." What made this practice so powerful was that it worked both internally and externally. When people began using more sophisticated language patterns in their thinking, their actual cognitive capacity expanded to match their linguistic sophistication. When they used these patterns in conversations with others, they naturally elevated the consciousness level of their interactions, creating upward spirals of development that benefited everyone involved. Sarah, the university professor from Piaget's earlier case study, became one of the most documented success stories of this approach. After learning about the 6 word categories and recognizing her tendency toward pre-operational thinking in relationships, Sarah committed to practicing conservation and systems thinking language in her marriage. Within 6 months, both she and her husband reported dramatic improvements in their communication and emotional intimacy. Sarah's transformation illustrated one of the most important discoveries of Piaget's final work. Consciousness development is contagious. When one person in a relationship, family, or organization begins consistently operating at a higher consciousness level, others naturally begin developing more sophisticated thinking patterns as well. The linguistic environment becomes a catalyst for collective development that benefits entire systems. The business applications of this discovery became equally transformative. Companies that trained their leaders in consciousness level recognition and development reported significant improvements in team collaboration, innovation, and problem-solving effectiveness. Employees felt more engaged and valued when their managers learned to communicate in ways that matched and gradually elevated their consciousness levels. Educational institutions that implemented Piaget's consciousness development approaches saw remarkable improvements in student engagement and academic performance. Teachers learned to recognize which word categories their students used naturally and design learning experiences that built on those strengths while gradually introducing more complex thinking patterns. Students developed not just academic knowledge, but actual cognitive capacity that served them throughout their lives. Perhaps most importantly, Piaget's final research revealed that consciousness development through linguistic practice had profound effects on emotional well-being and life satisfaction. People who developed more sophisticated thinking patterns reported feeling more resilient, optimistic, and capable of creating meaningful change in their lives. They experienced less anxiety and depression because they possessed cognitive tools for understanding and responding to life challenges more effectively. The 6 word categories that Piaget identified became a roadmap for lifelong development that anyone could follow. Causal thinking words helped people develop personal agency and understanding of complex systems. Temporal perspective words enhanced planning abilities and emotional regulation. Social relational words increased empathy and communication effectiveness. Classification words improved analytical thinking and decision-making. Conservation words built resilience and adaptability. Hypothetical thinking words expanded creativity and problem-solving capacity. But Piaget's most profound insight was recognizing that consciousness development is fundamentally about expanding our capacity for love, connection, and positive impact in the world. As people develop more sophisticated thinking patterns, they naturally become more compassionate, wise, and effective in creating positive change. Higher consciousness isn't about intellectual superiority, it's about enhanced capacity for understanding, caring, and contributing to human flourishing. The transformation that becomes possible when you begin consciously developing your consciousness level through these linguistic practices touches every aspect of your life. Your relationships become deeper and more satisfying because you can understand and communicate with greater sophistication. Your work becomes more meaningful and effective because you can think through complex challenges with enhanced cognitive tools. Your personal growth accelerates because you possess frameworks for understanding and developing yourself more systematically. Most importantly, you begin to see that you're not stuck with whatever consciousness level you happen to be operating at right now. Like Sophie, the 4-year-old who revealed her consciousness level through 6 simple words, you're constantly revealing and potentially developing your own level of thinking through the language you choose to use. Every conversation is an opportunity to either reinforce your current patterns or consciously choose words that reflect and develop higher levels of consciousness. If you've found value in understanding how these 6 word categories reveal and develop consciousness levels, I invite you to join our growing community of people committed to ongoing development and positive change. This isn't just about learning interesting concepts, it's about embarking on a lifelong journey of expanding your capacity to think, feel, and contribute more effectively to the world around you. Together, we explore the practical applications of consciousness development in relationships, careers, parenting, and personal growth. When you subscribe, you become part of a community where each person's development supports and accelerates everyone else's growth. You'll receive regular insights, practical exercises, and real-world examples that help you continue developing your consciousness in ways that enhance every aspect of your life. The next video in our exploration of Piaget's revolutionary discoveries will reveal the specific daily practices that successful participants in his consciousness development studies use to accelerate their growth. You'll learn exactly how to implement these 6-word categories in your own life and begin experiencing the transformation that becomes possible when you consciously develop your level of thinking and awareness. The journey from wherever you are now to where you're capable of becoming starts with understanding these patterns and continues with committed practice that creates lasting change.